When we think of the liberation of Europe, we usually picture tanks rolling through streets and infantry storming the beaches. However, securing Western freedom required two unconventional campaigns: a covert network of spies mapping the invasion, and a massive financial intervention to rebuild the ruins. In the early 1940s, the continent faced its first existential threat. The German military machine had crushed professional armies across Western Europe, creating a total vacuum of institutional power and civilian resistance. Even after those occupying forces were pushed back, a second crisis emerged. By the devastating hunger winter of 1947, starvation and destroyed infrastructure left the newly freed nations highly vulnerable to a Soviet takeover. Combating these twin threats fell to two unlikely leaders. One was an unassuming mother of two, operating deep in the shadows of occupied France. The other was an American statesman armed with spreadsheets and millions of tons of grain. Defeating totalitarian rule required abandoning the traditional military playbook. Success depended on fighting from the bottom up, with civilian espionage, and from the top down, with targeted economic engineering. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade was an upper-class, cosmopolitan mother. She was also the architect of Alliance, the largest intelligence ring in the French resistance. Fourcade built her operation by weaponizing the conservative gender biases of the 1940s. Because the occupying German forces did not believe a woman was capable of running a massive resistance network, she used their underestimation as a cloak of invisibility to manage 3,000 agents. Her network gathered incredibly detailed military intelligence. Alliance agents infiltrated German testing facilities and successfully uncovered the plans for Hitler's V-1 and V-2 rockets, allowing Allied forces to bomb the launch sites before they could destroy England. Their most critical contribution arrived just ahead of D-Day. A sculptor in the Alliance network created a 55-foot-long map detailing the Normandy beaches and German fortifications, providing the exact coordinates the Allies needed to navigate the invasion. The work came with immense personal risk. Hundreds of her agents were captured and systematically executed, and Fourcade herself was captured twice. In 1944, she stripped off her clothes, squeezed her frame through the bars of her jail cell, and crawled to safety on her hands and knees to avoid Gestapo torture. Without this grassroots espionage filling the intelligence gap, the physical liberation of Europe by Allied military forces would have faced nearly insurmountable odds. Yet the triumph of D-Day was met with a grim reality on the ground. When the fighting stopped, Allied forces had essentially liberated a graveyard. This graph tracks European economic output directly after the war. Agricultural and industrial production plunged far below pre-war levels by 1946. Millions of homes were reduced to rubble, and extreme food shortages forced civilian populations to survive on fewer than 1,500 calories a day. Joseph Stalin saw an opportunity in this collapse. Rather than deploying troops, he chose to wait out the crisis. His strategy relied on poverty and starvation to create enough domestic unrest to push Western European nations into communist revolutions organically. The military victory over fascism was effectively meaningless if the resulting economic chaos simply handed the continent over to a new totalitarian regime. To counter Stalin's strategy, the United States launched a top-down economic offensive. In 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed the European Recovery Program. This scale of intervention required massive political capital. President Harry Truman spent months lobbying a budget-conscious Congress to pass the Economic Cooperation Act. This diagram illustrates counterpart funds. The U.S. shipped goods and fuel to European governments, who sold them to citizens and businesses. The resulting local currency funded rebuilding loans. Furthermore, the Technical Assistance Program sent U.S. experts to European factories, multiplying their output. Marshall explicitly offered this aid to the Soviet Union and its allies. Stalin refused the offer, forcing Czechoslovakia and Poland to withdraw their interest, and formally drawing the heavy Iron Curtain across the continent. The Marshall Plan successfully weaponized capitalist productivity, flooding the continent with resources and filling the economic vacuum before communism could take root. By 1952, the United States had injected $13.3 billion into Western Europe. The massive influx of staples and raw materials effectively eradicated the starvation crisis. The long-term industrial results were even more pronounced. European industrial production spiked by 35%, sparking 2 decades of rapid, sustained growth. Marie Madeleine Fourcade survived the war and lived to see this thriving, rebuilt Europe. When she died in 1989, she was the first woman granted a funeral at Les Invalides, France's most prestigious military site. Fourcade's covert network provided the critical intelligence margin to win the war, while Marshall's plan provided the capital margin to win the peace. True freedom relies on both the courage to fight tyranny and the economic dignity to rebuild.